everyone for joining us. Today's topic is a little bit more somber than some of my usual topics. I've been joined today by Dr. Devon, by Vera Schiff, and by Frank Sommers to talk to us a little bit about Yom HaShoah, or Holocaust Memorial Day. This is something that in the Jewish community carries a lot of weight and a lot of meaning, but particularly this year, during COVID, when we've seen so many inequities come across the board, I think this is something that has a lot of meaning for all of us. And so without further ado, I'm going to invite each of our attendees, one at a time, to start by telling us their story and why today is important for them. Vera, would you like to go first?
Oh, yes, why not? Well, I think I come from Czechoslovakia a long time, a country that no longer exists, but my story is very relevant. It's relevant also to the medical world because throughout those years of my incarceration in Theresienstadt, the Nazi concentration camp in that country, I was working in a hospital off the camp, and I just finished saying to Sam that it was a very unique place where doctors tried desperately to help under unimaginative circumstances to patients who had been missing and lacking everything. And there's ethical standard, and the bar was set so high in the clinic in Prague. And I think the story was never really said, at least not to my knowledge. And I would hate that it should be forgotten once all of us are gone. And I think most of those people who worked there with me are gone due to, of course, age and passage of time. And I very much welcome an opportunity, perhaps with a large expansion of time, to share with you what we have done, how these people so valiantly and bravely coped to save some lives which really was beyond salvation. But I think the ethics of it, the idea of it, the standard of performance should not be forgotten now as the time has passed by. So I would be very much interested. I know that the scope of this session is short, and this is not time enough for the story about Theresienstadt and the Horton Hospital, in which I worked for 3 years, and which I think most of you would find fascinating. So my personal story is, of course, that I came as a teenager to this camp, and under normal circumstances, nursing helpers, so staff in hospitals, not traded on that age group, but all this fell by the wayside under the Nazis. Every pair of hands, capable hands, was welcome. And the situation was desperate in that sense. It does not relate to our current life, but I think it's still very important to remember and evaluate. And I came there, I was barely 16 with my family, my parents, sister, grandmother, all of who passed away there under different times at very horrible circumstances. But I think I'm the only survivor really of a large family of 50 members who perished in different camps. Not all of them went through Theresienstadt, and not all of them, but some of them went to the death camps. And I guess, again, the differences of a camp and death camps, perhaps there's another time to tackle that. But what I'm trying to say is that we should be ready to be open-minded, how to adjust to different challenges in life. Trust me that the Jewish population of Prague, by and large, middle-class, professional people, were in no way prepared for what was in store for us under the Nazis. We did not think and didn't suspect in a burst of nightmare that we are facing annihilation and physical obliteration. We did think that we might be discriminated against. And of course, anti-Semitism was nothing new in Europe. But that what was in store for us was so horrible and so unimaginable that, of course, most of us were taken by surprise. But what I'm trying to say, we had to adjust. We had to adjust that age-wise and conditions-wise. We were not ready for what we had to confront. But coming to our situation right now, which thank God is nowhere near what we had to cope with, that we have got to keep an open mind and open adaptability to changing circumstances. So I have spent in this camp where it was not really a death camp in the sense that we would have had gas chambers. They were there but never activated. But over 1,000 died to starvation and subhuman living conditions. And on the end of the day, after war came to an end, virtually over 92%, all Czech Jews were dead. And so, of course, there were some other countries who suffered through the discrimination. The history of Theresienstadt, the history, the tragedy of Shoah should serve at this station as a warning against all inequities in biases and prejudices, and I hope it really does. And I think it should be also remembered that man can rise to unimaginable challenges and circumstances the demands is set upon you. So we are facing the challenge of COVID, and I hope with the current expansion of a vaccination that we will soon be talking about it in the past tense. So far, not yet, but I mean, we have got to know that the medical profession is in a challenge, but is capable of going a long way to deal with any and one problems. So my experiences during the war prove you that although the very few of us survived, that handful of us is here to say what it was. And one opportunity I would love to share with you, the setup of the hospital, what we have done to help or to save some lives, although we knew that this is almost impossible. So maybe there will be another opportunity, and I don't want to overstay my time allowed to me to talk about my story. So if I have, if you want to pass it on to somebody else, or if you want to hear some more, dearest, I'm more than happy to continue.
What I'm hearing you say right now is that a large part of what the strength that got you through what I can't even begin to imagine as far as conditions are, was being able to adapt. And I think that is the most understated way I've ever heard someone describe what you've gone through. So I think that is remarkable, even now and even today, speaks to who you are as a human being. Let us turn to Dr. Sommers. Dr. Sommers, I know you and I have had the chance to discuss a little bit, but for the sake of our audience and for the sake of people watching, can you share a little bit of your stories, whatever you want to share? You're certainly under no obligation, and what you think is the most important thing you'd like people to take from that for today.
Thank you, Dr. Hill, and appreciate the opportunity to talk to colleagues about this subject. And in my 50 plus years of being in the medical profession, I believe this is the first time that in any kind of organized way, for example, through the OMA, the subject that so intimately influenced many of our lives, certainly the people on this panel, has for the first time, the very first time in my memory, is being tackled. And I think that is something that we all need to reflect on. How come? But to give you a flavor for why I'm here, my life was almost ended before I was born. At the time, in 1943, the Second World War was raging. The German army was getting defeated and pushed backwards from the east by the victorious Red Army of the Soviet Union. And yet, even though their defeat was pretty well foretold, they found a way to send Colonel Eichmann to my native city, Budapest. And under his direction, with the motivated help of the Hungarian police forces, the Gendarmerie, without whose help all the cattle cars that went to the extermination camps couldn't have been packed by something like 500,000 Hungarian Jewish people within a matter of 4 months. You can imagine what logistics that took at a time when the German army was retreating and was clearly seeing defeat. So I was born into that epoch, and basically my survival was related to the fact that we disobeyed the laws. The laws required all Jewish people to, after wearing a yellow star to identify themselves on the street, to then congregate in certain central collection points in the city, so-called ghettos, and from there people were entrained and driven to their deaths. In my immediate family, over 20 people have been exterminated, murdered by the German Nazi army. And we only survived because my parents, in their courage and wisdom, decided not to report to the concentration of the ghettos and instead sought shelter in some basements of bomb-damaged buildings where we lived like rats in the darkness without food, water, etc. Very difficult circumstances, and that was my initial infancy until we were liberated in January by the advancing Soviet Red Army. In my case, unfortunately, having experienced in the early stage the life-threatening reality of the Nazi hordes, we had to submit to the totalitarian system of a very strict Stalinist communist regime, which left pretty strong marks as well, living in fear, first from the Nazis' discovery and then from the secret police of the communist regime, until our opportunity to escape happened at the time of the Hungarian uprising in 1956, which actually was defeated again by the Soviet army. But there was a short period when the borders could be crossed, and our family escaped at that point into Austria. So then we started our life as refugees. And that's another segment or chapter in the interesting life of a doctor, to experience life as a refugee. Obviously, I was not a doctor then, I was a teenager. But we found haven in this wonderful country that we're in now. And I certainly felt a certain obligation to, in a sense, do whatever I could to help the world. And that led me to choose this profession of medicine, which has given wonderful opportunities to relieve suffering and to do other kinds of things that I was hoping would have some impact on never again allowing the kinds of atrocities that influenced my life to happen again. So eternal vigilance is important, and I believe that all of us, especially in our field, need to be mindful of maintaining our moral compass, which is especially difficult sometimes when we are facing the difficult pandemic times that we're in now. And if we have time, Sam, maybe we can talk a little about the contribution of the cream of the German medical profession, starting in the 1930s when the Nazi establishment came to power under Hitler, who readily, in a majority, became ardent supporters of the Nazi philosophy and regime and became very much enabling the authorities to carry out their dastardly deeds, including devising the gas chambers and the Cyclone B gases, which were used to annihilate so many people. That was done by elite German medical men and scientists. So maybe we can get back to that at some point. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sommers. I think I speak for many of us when I say you certainly have left a mark and you certainly have made a difference. Dr. Devon, would you like to share a little bit of your story, please?
So firstly, I'm just so honored to be with the other panelists here. I think that whatever I kind of have to say can't quite, and I'm probably going to, my voice will crack for sure, but I don't think I can kind of match the lived experiences that the two of you have. My father is a Holocaust survivor. He's still with us. He's 91 years old. And amazing how you guys can speak about your own experience and I can't even speak about my father's experience. But nonetheless, he was a child survivor. He was hidden in a wall for 2 years with his uncle and his aunt, who survived along with him. He lost his parents and his sister, who went to Treblinka, along with much of his extended family. He came to Canada as an orphan and worked every day of his life as a pattern layer till he turned 80 and retired. And so I always say that as a surgeon, I followed in his footsteps because he did a different kind of cutting, but in some ways, he certainly didn't have any of the opportunities that I did. And so I became a surgeon, but I became a surgeon ethicist, which is some people would say is an oxymoron. It's not. I guess having grown up, my father experienced further tragedy later in his life, where he had 2 children who he lost as well, not related to the Holocaust. But nonetheless, I basically grew up as his only child. And he was always very open about his experiences. And so I don't remember a time kind of not knowing his story or not knowing, what he dealt with as a young child. And I basically, I think, developed a sense of empathy I feel very deeply towards other people. And so when I went into medicine, even though I became a surgeon, I really was never that fascinated by the science of medicine. And I was always I really just loved people. And I wanted to kind of spend my energies thinking about the why to why we do things, as opposed to just the how. Because I study surgical ethics, I think there's misconceptions about the Holocaust that we have to understand. Dr. Sommers already mentioned that physicians, and this is so hard to really reconcile with what we do, but physicians were very much complicit in many of the decisions and actions of the Nazi regime. And the other, I think one of the misconceptions is that there was no moral code or ethics at that time. But in fact, those physicians did teach ethics. And so, ethics are a function of our society and of our current moral norms, but they actually did have moral norms. Those norms were just atrocious. It was that there was a racial superiority, for example. So I think, it's really important for people to realize that even though this is, part of our history, that it's not that long ago, and that keeping as Dr. Sommers said, your moral compass at the forefront of everything you do is really important. I think also history does repeat itself. There have been other cultural genocides, and one of them is in our own country. I recently went up to the James Bay coast to vaccinate Indigenous communities, and I met survivors of genocide. They were the same age as my parents. And I think, we sort of have this slogan to bear witness. And I think we need to change that. I don't think bearing witness is enough anymore. I think we need to all have a way to be activists and to do something. There are Canadians who do not have clean water, and they are victims of genocide. So I think that's another way in which this is, very close to me, because it's not just history, it's like ongoing events and not very far away from us. And then the third way in which I've recently very much been thinking about ethics and the Holocaust is that I've become a maid provider. And so providing euthanasia as the child of a Holocaust survivor comes with a whole collection of thinking that I have to go through about, what is the value of life, and is autonomy enough to have someone, end their life, because, eugenics meant that there was, mercy killings according to the German physicians at the time, German and Austrian physicians at the time. And so to now be on the other side of that and say, is what I'm doing acceptable? Is it okay? Does it honor my legacy? Do I honor my parents and my, the survivors? Is just another kind of way in which this has really kind of influenced me in my current career right now. So, and I'm happy to talk more about my father's story. My mom was actually born in the Ukraine because her family escaped Poland, and so she was able to be born there and immigrate actually to Austria afterwards. We sort of don't tell her story quite as often, but both of my parents essentially are survivors. Our first language at home has always been Yiddish. I speak fluent Yiddish, and it's been a privilege.
Thank you so much for that. And I agree with you. I also seem to have more trouble discussing this than the people who have actually lived and endured the horrificness. With that very organic beginning, I think it behooves us all to do a little bit of formal introductions. So for the audience who may not know who everyone is, allow me to have the pleasure of introducing Vera Schiff. Vera was born in Prague, Czechoslovakia, as she mentioned, and under Nazi occupation in 1942 was deported to a concentration camp, which I can't pronounce nearly as well as she can, but Theresienstadt, I'm not even going to try. She was deported to a concentration camp. I'm sorry. And following the war's end, was one of the many Jews who found out that all of her relatives had been killed in different concentration camps, and she was the sole survivor of her family. She continued somehow and moved to Canada and started a family and worked as a medical technologist specializing in hematology, and is the author of a book that was published in 1996 about the town the Nazi gave to the Jews, followed up by another book about Hitler's Inferno, her 8 personal histories from the Holocaust. And then in 2005, she also graced us with a translation of her mother's diary. She speaks to us today as a survivor with a unique insight into medical technology, into the medical field, as do all of our guests. And so I'll turn back to Vera for a moment and ask her to share in her own words the part of the story she wanted to share before.
No, I just saw that the story of the struggle of physicians and nurses and paramedical professionals in concentration camp is a heroic story of unsung heroes who is never really been nobody concentrated on it amidst all the endless litany of misery which the Nazis have committed the crimes on us. And I would very much like that it should not go in forgotten, because under those circumstances try to save life as well as they could. And we succeeded with few, but the attempts were there. So I think this is a very important to me. That's why I wrote the books. That's why I've tried to leave behind a warning what can happen if people fall historically into these type of regimes, which was very unexpected really in heart of Europe where I come from, because it was a democratic republic which tried to be open-minded and remove as many prejudices and biases as were historically in Europe around. But it was, and perhaps it would have succeeded if not for the tragedy of the Nazi expansion Europe over. But I think that we should all remember that this era, as terrible as it was, should be serve as a teaching purpose what all can happen and how we can avoid consequences of criminal regimes, which can be under disguise. And as has been mentioned, some very illustrious German physicians were working in the research. It was the Dr. Mengele who was working for a research institute. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin was renowned well over. Many Nobel Prize were awarded to German physicians. So it's not only that it's an educated nation, it also matters what you educate, not only that you educate. And unfortunately, if we allow, whatever it is a bias, we are on a very slippery slope into this disaster, which, as you might historically see, had unfolded in Europe in such a speed. How was it possible that the Germans had a world war within which they succeeded to murder 6 million Jews, which were only a side part of their struggle to establish rule over the world? So I think all this episode should serve today as a teaching experience, and I'm doing my best by writing the books and talking to many young people to be wary of situation and be aware of the situation around them for who they are voting when they go to the electoral vote. It's so important. It's easy to manipulate words, but you have got to be aware of what's happening behind it. So it is a teaching and educational struggle to create a better world, a world in which the experience of the Nazi Shoah would not be imaginable, it would be unthinkable. And I want to always remember that the 20th century Germany was a highly civilized country with best educational centers in the world, and yet we know the results. So my attempts to warn the world what can happen if you set certain principle aside and the human life becomes questionable and the value of it becomes questionable, this can be the result. So I think that we should continue to bring this to the awareness of people, although many years have passed since the war came to an end. We have 1945, there was a universal outcry, never again. And yet it happened again. It happened not in this extension, but there were genocides thereafter, and world, some at occasions looked tacitly on, and we did little. And I didn't want to end my life to say that I did nothing to prevent or say to people the horrible outcome if you watch it as it becomes bigger and bigger and eventually an unsurmountable problem, because every genocide could be controlled and it begins. It is proven that the murder of the 6 million Jews in Europe didn't have to happen. The Nazis were not born invincible. It's unfortunate that they allowed it to happen. And it is incumbent upon us not to learn the lesson and not to allow it repeat. And yet, as I keep on saying, we do know that there were genocides in Cambodia, genocides in the Balkans, Africa. We have many places where it's so we did something wrong. And my effort is to contribute as much as I can, my writings and talking, that we should be alert and never slack down, never think this is not my problem, because one murder somewhere is just as my problem as if it would be neighboring right next to me. So I think this is what I dedicated last years of my life to this purpose, and I hope that it resonates with many, and I see that there's a lot of efforts made to make this tragedy useful for future prevention of developing some other bloodsheds.
Thank you for that. You're absolutely right. We say never again, but even as we say it, it recurs worldwide and even far too close to home in our own country. We must do better. We must learn the lessons that we keep saying we will learn. And I'm hopeful that today will help at least some of our medical colleagues and some of the OMA staff people to hear that message a little bit more clearly. I'm going to take the opportunity to also introduce Dr. Frank Sommers officially. Dr. Frank Sommers, who I actually consider a friend, is a remarkable human being with a story that we've heard that started in a most challenging a fashion. He bears those scars with grace. In his current position as physician and psychiatrist, he has done remarkable things. He has founded the Canadian affiliate for the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. He's been the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, and his military psychiatry service in Afghanistan in 2007 is a long part of him carrying his life story forward and trying to make that difference. Here in Ontario, he led the Disaster Psychiatry Canada service, developed it and created it, a team of trained and committed psychiatric specialists who recognize and serve the mental health needs of people and communities affected by disaster. And Toronto was the unlucky but lucky recipient of those skills after we had our own disaster here a few years ago. The reduction and the prevention of post-disaster mental illness, the fostering of resilience, these are the things that Dr. Sommers speaks to me about and speaks to our community about. And so with that in mind, Dr. Sommers, I know how important it is to you to raise the issue of the medical community and the medical community in Germany, Nazi Germany, and the medical community today. So I'll turn it over to you to do that.
Thanks so much, Dr. Hill. As I started earlier, I mentioned this is the first time in my memory, having been in the medical realm since 1966, that this subject actually even comes up. And yet I would like my colleagues to know that the events that you are hearing about now have affected every day of my life, and I suspect the lives of my other panelists here as well, even if they were just descendants of Holocaust survivors. It has had a profound effect on our lives, the careers we have chosen, and how we work. And this may be something that is not readily remembered or even in the consciousness of most of our colleagues, who in most cases feel quite remote or removed when they hear the word Holocaust. And I can relate a short little vignette that came my way when we organized the Holocaust education in medicine webinar that Drs. Samantha Hill and the OMA supported on November the 10th last year. We had the publisher and editor-in-chief of The Lancet as one of the panel members, Dr. Richard Horton. And I had an opportunity to ask Dr. Horton about his, what to many of us seemed like sudden interest in the issue of the Holocaust, which was not evident prior, certainly in the publications that The Lancet put forward. And he mentioned that his whole attitude changed when he had an opportunity to visit Israel and spend time there with physicians and learn the true reality of how Israel was providing medical care to all its citizens, and in fact, even from people coming over from Gaza. And he also found out that the Holocaust was not a remote historical entity that it was for him and many of his student colleagues when they were learning, but it was an intimate, personal experience for almost everybody he spoke to in Israel. So this is a living reality in most of our lives. And I mentioned earlier how it influenced my own career path. And I'm very happy to have had an opportunity to be of help, both in terms of individual therapy work, and prior to that I was a family physician, but also in organizing our colleagues in a variety of organizations, such as the Attempt to Prevent Nuclear Holocaust, which at the time of the Cold War was a very hot issue in the early 80s. And more lately in organizing our, first of all, psychiatric colleagues, but also beyond that, all other healthcare providers to be more ready in providing help in a disaster. And when we began this work about 3 years ago, of course, the pandemic was not even on the horizon. So we fortunately, or unfortunately, as we might want to look at it, we're able to provide some important CME training that has now taken place 3 years in a row and will take place again on June 11th this year, this time virtually, where we actually are giving our colleagues tools to help them deal with the mental fallout of this terrible pandemic that globally has affected all of us, including some very learned, important contribution from one of the world's experts on dealing with grief and grieving. And I think all of us will benefit from that. So in terms of the German contribution, I think it is quite important for young doctors to learn about this. And I'm so relieved and celebrate actually that our own medical school is, I believe, the first one in this country that last year has introduced in its core curriculum a lecture on the Holocaust and its medical connections. And I expect that this will be going forward. And I hope that our campaign to promote this and enable all other medical schools in this country and other countries to be taking place will bear some fruit. I did have some correspondence with the deans of the 17 Canadian medical schools, and I'm happy to report 100% of them agreed that this was an important subject and they will explore ways to integrate it into their curricula. And why is this so important? So before the Holocaust, as in the 1930s, as some of you may know, German science and medicine was world leading. And in fact, there were Nobel Prizes and very high regard. So is it possible that these highly educated men, surrounded by wonderful culture, music, literature, would yield to an ideology promoted by a charismatic speaker who very gradually managed to ensnare the majority of the population to follow him into the abyss. And our highly trained colleagues, some of them Nobel Prize winners, followed just like the least educated person in that country. And they adopted the philosophy, I think Dr. Devon alluded to this, that they had a larger purpose than serving the individual patient. And that was the rationalization that their duty was to serve the nation, to serve the country, and the philosophy that the country espoused, which was building the Third Reich. And that justified the beginning of the euthanasia of the mental defectives, and parents would actually bring their children to doctors when they were somewhat considered in this group. And there are stories that parents pleaded with doctors. Initially, there were 2 doctors required to certify that this person should be euthanized. Eventually, 1 doctor's signature was sufficient. And then, of course, the concentration camps started appearing. Jewish businesses started to be closed, and Jewish people assaulted. And of course, Jewish professors and students being deprived of the opportunity to continue their professional work or their studies, and in many cases being sent to these concentration camps. So it's so important for us to realize that education and high intelligence does not necessarily protect us against the loss of basic human decency and human rights, and actually the whole bulwark and foundation of what it is to be a democratic nation. It is a lesson that is forevermore one that we should ignore at our peril, because those people were just as smart as we are, and they had lofty positions, and they potentially chose to turn their backs on the painful shoutings and the enormous wounds that they could see in their colleagues and their students, who very gradually were denied the same freedoms that they had experienced before, and that those who allied themselves with the regime could go on experiencing. And then, of course, that led to eventually the very concrete contribution to the building of the machinery of execution, because that's another issue that is not often thought about. How was it possible to literally cause the death of millions of men, women, and children who really had no other distinguishing feature, but they were born in a certain religion? and who in many cases were just as contributing to their societies. And I'm not just talking about Germany, but the same case was true in Hungary, in my country. And yet it counted for nothing. So what is it in a society that enables people to turn to the darkest parts of their nature and to deny their elementary basic humanity and to use their powers of rationalization that they talk themselves into believing that what they're doing is right? There are powerful lessons here that we ignore at our peril, as I said. So the relatives that I lost in those gas chambers, I hear their cries all the time. And this is the least I believe that we can do, is to learn their cries and hear their lessons. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sommers. Thank you for sharing that with us. A brief introduction to who Dr. Devon is and why she's joining us today. Child of a survivor who bears her parents' story forefront of her mind. She's a surgeon ethicist, as she said, in Toronto, and was one of very few physicians who volunteered and had the opportunity to participate in Operation Remote Immunity to provide immunization against COVID-19 to Indigenous people. And in doing so, she wrote about the resonance for her between cultures and between experiences. So acknowledging that we are getting towards the end of our scheduled time and that I'd like to get everyone to answer 2 more questions for me. I'll start with Dr. Devon, and the questions are, what do you wish everyone knew? And what have you personally learned as a result of your experiences? Small questions.
If anyone else is ready, I think I need a little more time to think about that specifically.
Dr. Sommers, Vera, do you think that you might be able to answer those questions? Have I asked too hard of a question? If so, then I'll take it back. The goal of this is certainly not to put any of the 3 of you in a more challenging position than you've already been. My goal is simply to carry forth your words and your messages and your learnings in a way that people hear and that it resonates, and to use this platform that I have for another little while to try and do that.
I think for me, one thing that resonates is that, you know, young people go to medical school and they think that they're going into sciences. You know, that's what they think medicine is a science. And there's so many scientific advances that can actually be either harmful or end up not being of benefit. And they're exciting because they're science. But if we don't think about the people behind the science, we can cause a lot of harm. And that applies to all kinds of technologies, even currently when we think about, you know, my husband is a geneticist and he's doing the most, you know, mind-blowing things, really, like analyzing a genome in a half an hour and figuring all these things out. But I think we have to be very careful to protect the vulnerable, even sometimes the vulnerable that are not yet with us when we're thinking about genetics, for example. So I think there's a real danger in sort of a blind belief in science and scientific principles, and that we all know that medicine is both an art and a science, but really, I think, you know, we always have to ask why as we go forward and adopt, you know, some of these things we're learning along the way. So I think for me, that's, you know, an important lesson.
Thank you so much.
I would like the victims of the Holocaust not to be forgotten, not necessarily in the sense of the drama which is unfolded, but as a warning to mankind how bad we can end up should we disregard and overlook the morality and the basic foundations of civilized world. And it's very much to be considered today when we have weapons of mass destruction in our fingertips. And if you just only can pause and think, if somebody that deranged as the leadership of the Nazi Germany of the 30s today had the key to the button, where would we all end? How would humanity have found its final solution? Not only the Jews for their final solution, but it will be a final solution to all of us. So it is a heavy warning which many people would like to disregard and ignore. That was some kind of event which happened in the dark past. It wasn't dark, and it was a past, and it should serve as a heavy warning for what could be in store for us if we choose to ignore ethics, morality, and if we choose to not to be perceive the equality of all of us as we go day by day about our lives. And I think this I will be very much want to give for the future generations. Be careful, be aware, because history is a powerful teacher and we ignore it at our own perils. So I think I would like to hope that we will do better by be cognizant what has happened, which obliterated 2,000 years presence of Jews in Europe, which will never be reconstructed ever again. So hopefully we will take a lesson of that. And thank you for having me for this conversation.
So maybe just a few words here. I would say in medicine, no matter how long we are in it, and often it's challenging, it is so important that we remain crystal clear about the sanctity of every human being and have a certain fundamental respect for every person. And regardless of what age or what background, I think sometimes it's difficult circumstances in which to practice that. But along with that, I think is the cultivation of empathy. I can see that as an extremely important reality of our brains, to cultivate that and never lose sight of why initially we actually entered this field. And this is in the face of challenges which many in the O may know about when there are systemic issues in the delivery of healthcare, and many of our colleagues are finding it very difficult in their personal lives to deal with the kind of demands placed on them. So this requires really a system-wide perception, not just of individual physicians, but in terms of our students. You're entering into a world of intense developments, rapid, even more rapid pace than before. Genomics was just mentioned. So it will be even more important to cultivate and maintain your ethical compass in the context of empathy, and particularly in the face of the reality that our profession is quite hierarchical, and there is a certain obedience that is expected as you go up the ladder. It is really, really important, I think, on an individual basis, when we see discrimination, when we see things that shouldn't be happening, that we speak up, whether it's prejudice or any kind of racism. When the language is not what it should be, don't stay silent, speak up in a civil way, let the person, the perpetrator, know that that's unacceptable. And I think each of us can contribute to building a healthier, more democratic society, and can stay vigilant to maintain it. If we remember that this can be lost, it can be lost. Let's remember that. It's not fundamental that this can go on always as it has been. So we have to be at the same time careful about that. And I think remembering the history of the Holocaust and the genocides can help us to maintain that clarity of moral purpose, and above all, cultivate empathy. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our time together. It's been a heavy hour, but it's been a very important hour. I hope that people listening can hear and have it resonate the same way it did for me today. I know that I've always felt that in Judaism, one of the most important principles is tikkun olam, or taking care of the world. And that's something I grew up with. And there are times in medicine, for sure, or in the world in general, when it just seems so broken that it's beyond any of our capacity to fix. And I think we have a duty to honor those whose lives have been lost in horrible, horrible ways, to use the learnings that came from that around empathy, around ethics, around how far we can fall as humans, and around individual responsibility to the global collective. So I thank you again. May the memories of those you've lost be a blessing. I know they are a weight that you carry always, but may they also be a blessing for you. And may today be part of all of our journey to do a little bit better tomorrow than we did yesterday. Thank you.